Hi friends, today I'm going to be sharing a chapter of one of my favorite books with you. I'm just going to be reading most of it, and this is kind of a different video, but one of my friends from university recently reached out to me about a project she's put together called Chapter at a Time, where participants or contributors, I guess, select a chapter of any work that they choose and just read it and share it. And I just thought it sounded like such a lovely collaborative idea and space that I was really excited to participate in. And as soon as I heard her describe the project, I knew which book I wanted to choose and share, and I'm gonna be reading it outside. I wanted to do that because the chapter I've selected is in part about listening to the language of the natural world, and so I thought it was fitting to read it outside. So I'm actually a little bit nervous and worried about the sound quality because I'm just gonna be in my backyard, so there might be like neighborhood sounds, vehicle sounds, but I'm just gonna do it and see how it works. Let's just go out and see how this goes. Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. When Torianne first reached out to me about Chapter at a Time, this was the first book that came to mind immediately because every chapter is more or less self-insulated and can be read standing alone, but each chapter as well also has so much richness and depth to offer. This book touches on Indigenous worldviews. It talks a lot about plant science and also goes into histories that have an impact on the way we live today. This book is deeply spiritual and beautiful in a way that is not present in most of the literature I come across. So yeah, this book is one of my favorite things. I won't be reading the whole chapter because it's quite long and dense, so I'll just read excerpts from it. But I picked this chapter because it speaks of alienation through the loss of language that really resonated with me, and I'm sure would resonate with other immigrants and children of immigrants or people who have been removed from their culture and feel that loss more strongly through the loss of language and the loss of being able to see the world through that specific lens. But for Kimmerer in this book, and then for North American Indigenous peoples whose language was forcibly stolen from them by the United States and by the Canadian government as well, the alienation through loss of language takes on a whole nother, more bitter and more painful meaning. And I'm going to do my best with the pronunciations of Potawatomi. I used Robin Wall Kimmerer's audiobook, which gives her pronunciations of these words, but I apologize for any mistakes in advance. I'll do my best. Learning the grammar of animacy. To be native to a place, we must learn to speak its language. My first taste of the missing language was the word Papoe on my tongue. I stumbled upon it in a book by the Anishinaabe ethnobotanist Kiwedinokwe, in a treatise on the traditional uses of fungi by our people. Papoe, she explains, translates as the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight. As a biologist, I was stunned that such a word existed. In all its technical vocabulary, Western science has no such term, no words to hold this mystery. You'd think that biologists of all people would have words for life. But in scientific language, our terminology is used to define the boundaries of our knowing. What lies beyond our grasp remains unnamed. In the 3 syllables of this new word, I could see an entire process of close observation in the damp morning woods, the formulation of a theory for which English has no equivalent. The makers of this word understood a world of being full of unseen energies that animate everything. I've cherished it for many years as a talisman and longed for the people who gave a name to the life force of mushrooms. The language that holds Papoe is one that I wanted to speak. So when I learned that the word for rising, for emergence, belonged to the language of my ancestors, it became a signpost for me. Had history been different, I would likely speak Potawatomi or Potawatomi, an Anishinaabe language. But like many of the 350 indigenous languages of the Americas, Potawatomi is threatened, and I speak the language you read. The powers of assimilation did their work, as my chance of hearing that language, and yours too, was washed from the mouths of Indian children in government boarding schools, where speaking your native tongue was forbidden. Children like my grandfather, who was taken from his family when he was just a little boy of 9 years old. This history scattered not only our words, but also our people. Today, I live far away from our reservation, so even if I could speak the language, I would have no one to talk to. But a few summers ago, at our yearly tribal gathering, a language class was held, and I slipped into the tent to listen. There was a great deal of excitement about the class because, for the first time, every single fluent speaker in our tribe would be there as a teacher. When the speakers were called forward to the circle of folding chairs, they moved slowly, with canes, walkers, and wheelchairs, only a few entirely under their own power. I counted them as they filled the chairs. 9. 9 fluent speakers. In the whole world. Our language, millennia in the making, sits in those 9 chairs. The words that praised creation, told the old stories, lulled my ancestors to sleep, rests today in the tongues of 9 very mortal men and women. Each in turn addresses the small group of would-be students. A man with long gray braids tells how his mother hid him away when the Indian agents came to take the children. He escaped boarding school by hiding under an overhung bank where the sound of the stream covered his crying. The others were all taken and had their mouths washed out with soap, or worse, for talking that dirty Indian language. Because he alone stayed home and was raised up calling the plants and animals by the name Creator gave them, he is here today, a carrier of the language. The engines of assimilation worked well. The speaker's eyes blaze as he tells us, "We're the end of the road. We are all that is left. If you young people do not learn, the language will die. The missionaries and the U.S. government will have their victory at last." A great-grandmother from the circle pushes her walker up close to the microphone. "It's not just the words that will be lost," she says. "The language is the heart of our culture. It holds our thoughts, our way of seeing the world. It's too beautiful for English to explain." Papoe. Jim Thunder, at 75, the youngest of the speakers, is a round brown man of serious demeanor who spoke only in Potawatomi. He began solemnly, but as he warmed to his subject, his voice lifted like a breeze in the birch trees, and his hands began to tell the story. He became more and more animated, rising to his feet, holding us rapt and silent, although almost no one understood a single word. He paused as if reaching the climax of his story and looked out at the audience with a twinkle of expectation. One of the grandmothers behind him covered her mouth in a giggle, and his stern face suddenly broke into a smile as big and sweet as a cracked watermelon. He bent over laughing, and the grandmas dabbed away tears of laughter, holding their sides while the rest of us looked on in wonderment. When the laughter subsided, he spoke at last in English. What will happen to a joke when no one can hear it anymore? How lonely those words will be when their power is gone. Where will they go? Off to join the stories that can never be told again. So now my house is spangled with post-it notes in another language, as if I were studying for a trip abroad. But I'm not going away. I'm coming home. I think that passage really illustrates how tragic and the scale of the wrongdoing that this loss of language holds for these people. To continue, Nepija Ajayan? Asked the little yellow sticky note on my back door. My hands are full and the car is running, but I switch my bag to the other hip and pause long enough to respond. Odanik Ndeja. I'm going to town. And so I do. To work, to class, to meetings, to the bank, to the grocery store. I talk all day and sometimes write all evening in the beautiful language I was born to, the same one used by 70% of the world's people, a tongue viewed as the most beautiful, with the richest vocabulary in the modern world. English. When I get home at night to my quiet house, there is a faithful post-it note on the closet door. Gisken Igabiskuagin. And so I take off my coat. I cook dinner, putting utensils from cupboards labeled Mkwanen, Nagin. I have become a woman who speaks Potawatomi to household objects. When the phone rings, I barely glance at the post-it note there, as I dopnen the gikdagan. And whether it is a solicitor or a friend, they speak English. Once a week or so, it is my sister from the West Coast who says, Bonjour, mokche wengwenida, as if she needed to identify herself. Who else speaks Potawatomi? To call it speaking is a stretch. Really, all we do is blurt garbled phrases to each other in a parody of conversation. How are you? I am fine. Go to town. See bird. Red. Fry bread good. We sound like Tonto's side of the Hollywood dialogue with the Lone Ranger. Me try talk good Injun way. On the rare occasion when we can actually string together a halfway coherent thought, we freely insert high school Spanish words to fill in the gaps, making a language we call Spanawatomi. There are fewer letters in our alphabet, so the distraction among words for a beginner is often subtle. With the beautiful clusters of consonants of zh and mb and shwe and kwe and mshk, our language sounds like wind in the pines and water over rocks, sounds our ears may have been more delicately attuned to in the past, but no longer. To learn again, you really have to listen. To actually speak, of course, requires verbs, and here is where my kindergarten proficiency at naming things leaves off. English is a noun-based language, somehow appropriate to a culture so obsessed with things. Only 30% of English words are verbs, but in Potawatomi that proportion is 70%, which means that 70% of the words have to be conjugated, and 70% have different tenses and cases to be mastered. European languages often assign gender to nouns, but Potawatomi does not divide the world into masculine and feminine. Nouns and verbs both are animate and inanimate. You hear a person with a word that is completely different from the one with which you hear an airplane. Pronouns, articles, plurals, demonstrative verbs, all of those syntactical bits I never could keep straight in high school English are all aligned in Potawatomi to provide different ways to speak of the living world and the lifeless one. Different verb forms, different plurals, different everything apply depending on whether what you are speaking of is alive. No wonder there are only 9 speakers left. I try, but the complexity makes my head hurt, and my ear can barely distinguish between words that mean completely different things. One teacher reassures us that this will come with practice, but another elder concedes that these close similarities are inherent in the language. As Stuart King, a knowledge keeper and great teacher, reminds us, the Creator meant for us to laugh, so humor is deliberately built into the syntax. Even a small slip of the tongue can convert "we need more firewood" to "take off your clothes." In fact, I learned that the mystical word popoi is not only used for mushrooms, but also for certain other shafts that rise mysteriously in the night. My sister's gift to me one Christmas is a set of magnetic tiles for the refrigerator in Ojibwe, or Anishinaabemowin, a language closely related to Potawatomi. I spread them out on my kitchen table looking for familiar words, but the more I looked, the more worried I got. Among the 100 or more tiles, there was but a single word that I recognized. Miigwech, thank you. The small feeling of accomplishment from months of study evaporated in a moment. I remember paging through the Ojibwe dictionary she sent, trying to decipher the tiles, but the spellings didn't always match, and the print was too small, and there are way too many variations on a single word, and I was feeling that this was just way too hard. The threads in my brain knotted, and the harder I tried, the tighter they became. Pages blurred and my eyes settled on a word, a verb of course, to be a Saturday. Pfft! I threw down the book. Since when is Saturday a verb? Everyone knows it's a noun. I grabbed the dictionary and flipped more pages, and all kinds of things seemed to be verbs. To be a hill, to be red, to be a long sandy stretch of beach. And then my finger rested on wikwigama, to be a bay. Ridiculous, I ranted in my head. There is no reason to make it so complicated. No wonder no one speaks it. A cumbersome language, impossible to learn. And more than that, it's all wrong. A bay is most definitely a person, place, or thing, a noun, and not a verb. I was ready to give up. I'd learned a few words, done my duty to the language that was taken from my grandfather. Oh, the ghosts of the missionaries in the boarding school must have been rubbing their hands in glee at my frustration. She's going to surrender, they said. And then I swear I hear the zap of synapses firing. An electric current sizzled down my arm and through my finger and practically scorched the page where that one word lay. In that moment, I could smell the water on the bay, watch it rock against the shore, and hear it sift onto the sand. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb wikwigama, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that, for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers. Because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall. And there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday. All are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. Water, land, and even a day. The language a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world, the life that pulses through all things, through pines and nuthatches and mushrooms. This is the language I hear in the woods. This is the language that lets us speak of what wells up all around us. And the vestiges of boarding schools, the soap-wielding missionary wraiths, hang their head in defeat. This is the grammar of animacy. Imagine seeing your grandmother standing at the stove in her apron and saying of her, "Look, it is making soup. It has gray hair." We might snicker at such a mistake, but we also recoil from it. In English, we never refer to a member of our family or indeed to any person as it. That would be a profound act of disrespect. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reducing a person to a mere thing. So it is that in Potawatomi and most other indigenous languages, we use the same words to address the living world as we use for our family, because they are our family. To whom does our language extend the grammar of animacy? Naturally, plants and animals are animate, but as I learn, I'm discovering that the Potawatomi understanding of what it means to be animate diverges from the list of attributes of living beings we all learned in Biology 101. In Potawatomi 101, rocks are animate, as are mountains and water and fire and places. Beings that are imbued with spirit. Our sacred medicines, our songs, drums, and even stories are all animate. The list of the inanimate seems to be smaller, filled with objects that are made by people. Of an inanimate being, like a table, we say, "What is it?" And we answer, "Dopunyewe, table it is." But of apple, we must say, "Who is that being?" And reply, "Nishimin Yahweh, apple that being is." Yahweh, the animate, to be. I am, you are, she, he is. To speak of those possessed with life and spirit, we must say, Yahweh. By what linguistic confluence do Yahweh of the Old Testament and Yahweh of the New World both fall from the mouths of the reverent? Isn't this just what it means? To be, to have the breath of life within, to be the offspring of creation? The language reminds us in every sentence of our kinship with all of the animate world. English doesn't give us many tools for incorporating respect for animacy. In English, you are either a human or a thing. Our grammar boxes us in by the choice of reducing a non-human being to an it, or it must be gendered inappropriately as a he or a she. Where are words for the simple existence of another living being? Where is our Yahweh? My friend Michael Nelson, an ethicist who thinks a great deal about moral inclusion, told me about a woman he knows, a field biologist whose work is among other than humans. Most of her companions are not two-legged, and so her language has shifted to accommodate her relationships. She kneels along the trail to inspect a set of moose tracks, saying, "Someone's already been this way this morning." "Someone is in my hat," she says, taking out a deer fly. Someone, not something. A language teacher I know explained that grammar is just the way we chart relationships in language. Maybe it also reflects our relationships with each other. Maybe a grammar of animacy could lead us to whole new ways of living in the world. Other species, a sovereign people, a world with a democracy of species, not a tyranny of one, with moral responsibility to water and wolves, and with a legal system that recognizes the standing of other species. It's all in the pronouns. Learning the grammar of animacy could well be a restraint on our mindless exploitation of land. But there is more to it. I have heard our elders give advice like, "You should go among the standing people," or "Go spend some time with those beaver people." They remind us of the capacity of others as our teachers, as holders of knowledge, as guides. Imagine walking through a richly inhabited world of birch people, bear people, rock people, beings we think of and therefore speak of as persons worthy of our respect, of inclusion in a peopled world. We Americans are reluctant to learn a foreign language of our own species, let alone another species. But imagine the possibilities. Imagine the access we would have to different perspectives, the things we might see through other eyes, the wisdom that surrounds us. We don't have to figure out everything by ourselves. There are intelligences other than our own, teachers all around us. Imagine how much less lonely the world would be. Every word I learn comes with a breath of gratitude for our elders who have kept this language alive and passed along its poetry. I still struggle mightily with verbs, can hardly speak at all, and I'm still most adept with only kindergarten vocabulary. But I like that in the morning I can go for my walk around the meadow greeting neighbors by name. When Crow calls at me from the hedgerow, I can call back, "Manongishket andushukwe." I can brush my hand over the soft grasses and murmur, "Bojo, mishkos." It's a small thing, but it makes me happy. I'm not advocating that we all learn Potawatomi or Hopi or Seminole, even if we could. Immigrants come to these shores bearing a legacy of languages, all to be cherished. But to become native to this place, if we are to survive here, and our neighbors too, our work is to learn to speak the grammar of animacy so that we might truly be at home. I remember the words of Bill Tallbull, a Cheyenne elder. As a young person, I spoke to him with a heavy heart, lamenting that I had no native language with which to speak to the plants and the places that I love. "They love to hear the old language," he said. "It's true. But," he said, with fingers on his lips, "you don't have to speak it here. If you speak it here," he said, patting his chest, "they will hear you." So I hope you enjoyed that chapter. It really illustrated beautifully this journey that Kimra goes on to reclaim her native language and the struggles that she faces and the root of why it's important and why she would want to learn it in the first place. And I just think that it's such a beautiful chapter. I would like to also leave you with a passage from the chapter called Nanabojo, In the Footsteps of Nanabojo, Becoming Indigenous to a Place. Nanabojo in the Anishinaabe creation myths is the original man, the first man to come to what they refer to as Turtle Island, which is the name of the land or the continent, I guess. And it speaks of Nanabojo as the first immigrant in a land already densely populated with the tree people, the animal people, all of the creatures of creation. And it speaks of becoming indigenous in a time when much of the flora and fauna around us is not indigenous. I get up from my needle-soft nook between grandmother's roots and walk back to the trail where I am stopped in my tracks. bedazzled by my new neighbors, giant firs, sword fern, and salal, I had passed by an old friend without recognition. I'm embarrassed to not have greeted him before. From the east coast to the edge of the west, he had walked here. Our people have a name for this round-leafed plant: white man's footstep. Just a low circle of leaves pressed close to the ground with no stem to speak of, it arrived with the first settlers and followed them everywhere they went. It trotted along paths through the woods, along wagon roads and railroads, like a faithful dog so as to be near them. Linnaeus called it Plantago major, the common plantain. Its Latin epithet, plantago, refers to the sole of a foot. At first, the native people were distrustful of a plant that came with so much trouble trailing behind it. But Nanabojo's people knew that all things have a purpose, and that we must not interfere with its fulfillment. When it became clear that White Man's Footstep would be staying on Turtle Island, they began to learn about its gifts. In spring, it makes a good pot of greens, before summer heat turns the leaves tough. The people became glad for its constant presence when they learned that the leaves, when they are rolled or chewed to a poultice, make a fine first aid for cuts, burns, and especially insect bites. Every part of the plant is useful. Those tiny seeds are good medicine for digestion. The leaves can halt bleeding right away and heal wounds without infection. Maybe White Man's Footstep is following in Nanabojo's. Perhaps plantain will line the homeward path. We could follow. White Man's Footstep, generous and healing, grows with its leaves so close to the ground that each step is a greeting to Mother Earth. I really appreciated that passage and this chapter because it demonstrates ways that immigrants can also learn to respect and name the land in a way that's appreciated reciprocally by the land and the people here, and I think it just speaks to an ethos that I find really valuable and think is probably very necessary. I hope you all enjoyed and found something in these passages that I shared with you. I highly, highly, highly recommend everyone get a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass or find it somehow. I was able to get the audiobook from my library for free, so I hope everyone has a chance to read this sometime in their life. So that was my chapter time reading. I really enjoyed this mode of sharing by actually reading a passage from the text instead of like making the listener or viewer trust the reviewer's opinion and then actually putting a sampling of the text into your ears or hands or whatever, instead of making you have to seek out a work in order to even try it out. I also want to say that what I shared is just a tiny, tiny fraction of a taste of everything that this book has to offer, and I hope that I, having read it, and anyone who reads this book and has this book in their lives can then go forth and like glean some wisdom from this and lead their lives in a different way. Like, this book talks a lot about consumerism and living within a consumer and capitalistic society and how we can begin to think differently about the ways we consume and more consciously about the ways we interact with and exist on this planet. And so I think that there's so much value to be gained from so many different parts of this book. I even got some like gardening advice, which I've been trying out this season, which is really exciting. And so this just like has so much that I can't just share in a video. You should really just see for yourself all of the magic that happens in here. And also, having gone through the motions and done this like whole reading a chapter thing, I'm reminded that there's also a really great podcast that does this as well, that invites writers on to the show, and they read a selection of either their writing or someone else's writing and then just talk about it and say what they like about it. It's really great. Recommend it. It's the On Being podcast. They're based in Minneapolis. Yeah, I think that's a great source of finding a lot of really good literature. The last thing that I want to leave you with are two fundraisers. One is to a COVID-19 relief fund for the Navajo and Hopi nations who have been affected with the COVID-19 virus at higher infection rates than any community in the United States. And as you may know, the United States has been affected at higher rates than any country in the world. So yeah, it's just such a shame that the reasons that this community's been hit so hard are directly tied to historical and systemic oppressions against the First Nations. So there's that link, and then there's also a link to support the Quileute Nation on the West Coast who are trying to move their nation's school to a safer location. And as I've spoken about in this video, I think that the value of education and preservation of culture and language cannot be overstated. So I just wanted to share those two links with you all as well, and will be donating myself. So that is gonna do it, I think. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to. Thank you all so much for watching as always. Leave a comment, maybe like a heart or something. I'll see you guys in another video sometime soon. Bye bye.